The first thing Richard Witmore notices is not the crying. It's the hands. Rough fingers press against the polished granite of the headstone. The skin is cracked along the knuckles, pale scars running through calluses hardened by years of labor. The kind of hands that scrub floors, haul trash bins, scrape rust off old railings. A janitor's hands. They rest against the cold, flawless surface of the gravestone Richard paid a fortune to carve. The contrast is jarring. Weathered skin against perfect stone. The man kneels in the grass beneath the ancient oak tree, shoulders trembling with quiet, contained sobs. His head hangs low, face buried in those rough hands as if the grief itself is too heavy to carry upright. Richard stops walking. The gravel path crunches under his shoes, loud in the morning stillness. The red rose in his hand trembles slightly, its petals dark against the black of his coat. For 10 years, this place has been his private ritual. Every October 14th, he comes alone. No driver, no assistant, no phone calls. Just the hill beneath the oak tree where Isabelle rests. But today someone else is here, and someone else is crying for his daughter. The morning air smells faintly of damp leaves and river wind drifting in from Brooklyn Harbor. A pale stripe of sunlight filters through the branches above, turning the scattered autumn leaves into flickers of gold. Richard takes a slow step forward. The man still hasn't noticed him. Next to the kneeling figure sits a little girl. She's cross-legged on the ground beside the gravestone, focused on something in front of her with intense concentration. Her small hands move carefully, placing pebble after pebble into a tiny stack. A little tower of stones. Her jacket is purple, but faded at the elbows. Her curly brown hair is tied into 2 uneven pigtails. The sneakers on her feet look slightly too large, the laces dragging on the grass. She hums softly to herself as she works, completely unaware that the richest real estate developer in the Northeast is standing 10 feet away, frozen in place. Richard's chest tightens. This grave was supposed to be sacred, private, untouched by strangers. His fingers curl tighter around the stem of the rose until a thorn pricks his skin. He opens his mouth to speak. But before he can say anything, the little girl looks up. Her eyes meet his. And time stops. Richard feels it physically, like the ground beneath him has shifted. Blue. Deep blue eyes with tiny flecks of gold circling the iris. He knows those eyes. He has seen them in childhood photos, in old home videos, in the reflection of hospital lights 10 years ago. Isabelle's eyes. The little girl studies him with calm curiosity, tilting her head slightly. Behind her, the man is still crying. Real, broken sobs now low and restrained, like someone trying desperately not to disturb the quiet of the dead. Richard clears his throat. The sound feels too loud in the still air. "Excuse me," he says. His voice comes out sharper than he intended. The man startles. He lifts his head quickly, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. His eyes are red and swollen, his expression startled and embarrassed, like someone caught trespassing somewhere sacred. "Oh, God. I'm sorry," the man says, scrambling awkwardly to his feet. "I didn't realize anyone was here." Richard steps closer, the rose still clenched in his hand. "This is my daughter's grave," he says quietly. The man freezes. For a second, he simply stares. Then realization dawns across his face. "You're Richard Witmore," he says slowly. It isn't a question. Richard nods once. "And you are?" The man swallows hard, glancing briefly down at the gravestone before answering. "My name is Darius Holt." His voice is rough, but steady now. "And this is Amara." The little girl stands up beside him, brushing dirt off her knees. She looks up at Richard again, studying his face with the open curiosity only children possess. "Mister," she says softly. Her voice is light, almost musical. "Are you sad?" The question catches Richard off guard. "What?" "My dad says people come here when they're sad," Amara explains matter-of-factly. "Because someone they love lives here." Richard's throat tightens. For a moment, he cannot speak. He looks down at the gravestone. Isabelle Marie Witmore, 1989, 2013. Beloved daughter. She painted the world with her dreams. 10 years. 10 years of apologies spoken to cold granite. When he finally looks back at the strangers in front of him, his voice is quieter. Why are you here? He asks. Darius hesitates. He glances once more at the grave, then at Amara. His expression shifts something between sorrow and respect. I came to visit my sister, he says slowly. Her grave is over there. He gestures vaguely toward another row of headstones further down the hill. But I also come here sometimes. Richard's brow tightens. Why? Darius exhales slowly, as if the answer carries weight. Because Isabelle mattered to someone I loved very much. Richard studies him carefully. And who would that be? For a moment, the only sound is the wind rustling through the oak leaves overhead. Then Darius looks down at the little girl standing beside him. His hand rests gently on her shoulder. Amara, he says quietly. The child looks up at him, then back at Richard. Her bright blue eyes catch the morning light again. And Richard suddenly feels an unease settle deep in his chest, an instinct he cannot yet explain. Darius takes a breath. I think, he says slowly, we should talk. The red rose slips from Richard's hand. It lands silently on the blanket of fallen leaves. The rose lies where it fell, red against the brown blanket of autumn leaves. Richard barely notices. His attention is locked on the child. Those eyes. The same shade of blue he once saw across a dinner table when Isabelle was 6, swinging her legs under the chair and telling him she wanted to paint the sky purple someday. Now those eyes are staring back at him from a stranger's face. The wind rustles through the oak branches above them. A few leaves drift down slowly, landing around the small tower of stones Amara has been building beside the grave. Darius clears his throat. I didn't expect you to be here this early, he says carefully. Richard's voice comes out low. I always come early. Darius nods once, absorbing that. For a moment, the three of them stand in an uneasy triangle beneath the tree. Then Amara crouches again and adjusts the top pebble on her tiny pyramid. It keeps falling, she mutters to herself. The pink one is too smooth. Her small fingers steady the stack. Richard watches the movement, strangely transfixed. Amara, Darius says gently, why don't you go find a few more stones over by the path? The girl glances up. But I like these ones. I know, Darius replies. Just a few more. Daddy needs to talk for a minute. She studies his face, sensing the seriousness in his voice. Then she nods. Okay. She grabs a handful of pebbles and skips toward the gravel path nearby, sneakers scuffing lightly against the ground. The moment she is several yards away, Richard turns back to Darius. Start explaining, he says. His tone isn't loud, but it carries the quiet authority of someone used to being answered. Darius lowers himself slowly onto the grass beside the headstone, leaning back against the stone as if the strength has drained from his legs. Richard remains standing for a second longer. Then, almost unconsciously, he sinks down across from him. The expensive fabric of his coat presses into the damp ground. Neither of them comment on it. Darius runs a hand through his hair. You probably never heard the name Adrian Cole, he begins. Richard shakes his head. No. He was my best friend, Darius continues. We grew up together in Brooklyn, same high school, same neighborhood. Richard says nothing. Darius looks toward the gravestone again. Adrian met Isabelle about 11 years ago. Richard's brows draw together. Where? At an art class, Darius says. Brooklyn Community Center. Richard feels something twist in his chest. Art class. He didn't know she took art classes there. He didn't know she took art classes anywhere. They fell in love pretty fast, Darius continues quietly. Adrian used to talk about her like she was sunlight or something. He gives a small, sad laugh. Kept saying he'd never met anyone who saw the world the way she did. Number 4. Richard stares at the ground. A memory flickers through his mind. Isabelle at 10 years old, holding up a painting of a sunrise with too many colors in the sky. He had barely looked at it before leaving for a flight. Darius continues. They wanted a simple life, he says. Nothing fancy. Adrian worked with wood, built furniture. Isabelle painted murals sometimes, did little art commissions. He pauses. They were planning to leave New York eventually. Richard's head lifts slightly. Leave? Somewhere quieter, Darius says. Upstate. Maybe Vermont. The image lands strangely in Richard's mind. Isabelle in a small house surrounded by trees. Paint on her hands. No glass towers. No boardrooms. Just a life he had never asked about. Darius draws in a slow breath. Then Isabelle got pregnant. Richard's heart stutters. What? Darius meets his eyes. They were thrilled, he says. Scared, too, but happy. Richard feels the air thin around him. When? He asks quietly. About 9 years ago. Richard's gaze shifts slowly toward the gravel path where Amara is now kneeling, inspecting stones like rare treasure. 9 years old. The number lands heavily. They named her Amara, Darius says. Silence stretches between them. Richard's pulse pounds in his ears. Why didn't Isabelle tell me? He asks at last. The question sounds almost childlike. Darius hesitates before answering. She thought you wouldn't approve. Richard's jaw tightens. That's not true. But even as he says it, the words feel weak. Darius doesn't argue. He just says gently, Adrian wasn't part of your world. Richard looks away. He was a carpenter, Darius adds quietly. From Bed-Stuy. A faint breeze moves through the cemetery, stirring the fallen leaves. Darius's voice lowers. There was another reason she didn't tell you. Richard's gaze returns to him. What reason? Darius holds his eyes. She said you were always busy. The words land softly, but they strike with the weight of a hammer. Meetings, Darius continues. Business trips. Deals. Richard's throat tightens. She tried calling you a few times when she first found out, Darius says. Adrian told me that, but you were overseas most of that month. So, Tokyo. The memory flashes like lightning. A 14-hour flight. A hospital room. A white sheet. Richard closes his eyes briefly. So she stopped trying, Darius finishes. Neither man speaks for a while. The only sound is the distant scraping of small stones as Amara continues her search along the path. Finally, Richard asks quietly, And the accident? Darius exhales slowly. My sister Elena was driving that night, he says. They had gone to an art exhibit in Manhattan. Adrian stayed home with the baby because he had the flu. Richard listens, unmoving. The rain was bad, Darius continues. Bridge roads were slick. He swallows. The car lost control. Richard nods faintly. He knows the rest. Everyone in New York had known the story back then. What he didn't know, what he had never been told, was that his daughter had left behind a child. Richard looks toward Amara again. She stands up suddenly and waves something in the air. Daddy? She calls happily. I found another pink one. Darius's eyes soften as he watches her. Then he turns back to Richard. She's Isabelle's daughter, he says quietly. Richard feels the truth settle deep in his chest. Heavy, unavoidable. Across the grass, Amara begins running back toward them, clutching the small stone in her hand. Richard doesn't realize he has stopped breathing until she reaches them. She kneels beside the tiny pyramid again and proudly places the pink pebble on top. The stack finally holds. She beams up at them. See? She says. It works now. The tiny tower of stones stands steady now. Amara leans back on her heels, satisfied, brushing dirt from her palms. The small pink pebble sits perfectly balanced on top, catching a glimmer of pale morning light. There, she says proudly. It won't fall anymore. Richard stares at the little structure as if it carries a meaning he hasn't fully understood yet. A child's monument. Fragile. Carefully built. Darius watches the girl for a moment before speaking quietly. Amara, sweetheart, could you go look for a few more stones near the oak roots? Amara tilts her head. But I already found the best ones. Just a few more, Darius says gently. We'll make it even taller. She considers that. Then shrugs. Okay. She skips away toward the thick roots of the oak tree, humming softly to herself as she searches through the leaves. When she is far enough that her small footsteps fade into the background, Darius reaches into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulls out an old envelope. The paper is creased along the edges, the corners softened by years of being folded and unfolded. He turns it over once in his hands before offering it to Richard. Adrian kept this, he says. Richard hesitates before taking it. The envelope feels surprisingly light, almost delicate. What is it? He asks. A letter, Isabelle wrote, Darius replies. Richard's heart gives a sudden, painful thud. She never mailed it, Darius adds. It was meant for a friend of hers. Adrian found it among her things after everything happened. Richard looks down at the envelope. The handwriting on the front is unmistakable. Elegant. Curving. Isabelle's. His fingers tremble slightly as he opens it. The paper inside unfolds with a soft rustle. For a moment, the words blur before his eyes. Then, slowly, painfully, they come into focus. Dear Sarah, I'm writing this while Adrian is asleep in the next room. We just finished painting the nursery walls. You'd laugh if you saw it. Adrian insisted on painting tiny stars across the ceiling, even though neither of us can paint straight lines. But it looks beautiful, and I'm happy. That still feels strange to write. I'm pregnant, Sarah. Adrian and I are having a baby. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night terrified because I don't know if I'll be a good mother. Then Adrian wraps his arms around me and says, "We'll figure it out together." He always says together. I've never had someone say that to me before. I haven't told my dad. Part of me wishes I could. But I know what he expects for my life. He wants a future built from skyscrapers and boardrooms and people who wear suits like armor. Adrian builds things with his hands. Tables. Shelves. Chairs that creak a little but never break. He's not the kind of man my dad imagined for me, but he's the kind of man who makes me laugh until I can't breathe. And I love him for that. After the baby comes, we're thinking about leaving New York. Maybe Vermont. Maybe Maine. Somewhere quiet. Adrian can work with wood. I can paint. And maybe one day the baby will run through the yard chasing butterflies. Part of me feels guilty for leaving. I used to believe my dad would change someday. That maybe if I waited long enough, he'd see me instead of the plans he made for me. But waiting hurts too much. Maybe when the baby gets older, I'll give him another chance to know us. Everyone deserves a second chance. Right? Love, Isabelle. By the time Richard reaches the last line, his vision is clouded. The paper trembles in his hands. The wind moves softly through the oak branches above them, scattering another handful of golden leaves across the grass. For a long moment, he cannot speak. He simply stares at the signature. Isabelle. The letters curve exactly the way they used to when she signed birthday cards or school permission slips he rarely looked at closely. She was happy, Richard finally whispers. Darius nods quietly. Yes, he says. Richard closes his eyes briefly. Images begin to form in his mind, images he had never seen before, but now cannot stop imagining. Isabelle standing in a small kitchen, paint on her hands. Adrian laughing as he brushes sawdust from his shirt. A baby's crib beneath a ceiling full of uneven stars. A life that existed just beyond the edges of the empire Richard built. A life he never knew. What happened after she died? Richard asks hoarsely. Darius exhales slowly. Adrian fell apart, he says. He blamed himself for weeks. Said if he hadn't gotten sick that night, Isabelle would have stayed home. Richard lowers his gaze. But he had Amara, Darius continues, and she needed him. His voice softens. So he kept going. Richard listens silently. He learned everything, Darius says. Bottle feeding, diapers, lullabies. He worked nights in the wood shop after Amara fell asleep. A faint smile flickers across his face. He used to carry her around the shop in a sling while he sanded furniture. Richard swallows hard. And then? He asks quietly. Darius's smile fades. 3 years later, he says. Adrian was working a construction job downtown. A beam fell from above. Richard's chest tightens. It killed him instantly. The words hang heavy in the air. For a moment, neither man moves. Then Darius speaks again. Before that happened, Adrian made me promise something. Richard looks up. If anything ever happened to him, Darius says, I would take care of Amara. Richard turns slowly toward the path. Amara is crouched in the grass again, examining a shiny gray stone like it might be treasure. So you raised her, Richard says. Yes. Alone? Darius nods once. I tried contacting you after Adrian died, he adds quietly. Richard's head snaps back toward him. You did? 3 times, Darius says. Calls to your office. Richard feels a hollow drop inside his chest. I left messages, Darius continues. But no one ever called back. Richard's mind flashes through years of assistance, gatekeepers, schedules packed tight with deals. Messages that never reached him. Or worse, messages he ignored. I didn't know, he says softly. Darius studies him. For the first time, there is no accusation in his expression. Only tired honesty. I believe you. A sudden burst of laughter breaks the silence. Amara runs back toward them, holding up a smooth pink stone. Look, she says excitedly. This one is even better. She kneels beside the tiny tower again, carefully adding the new stone near the top. It wobbles slightly, then steadies. Amara beams. Richard watches her quietly. His granddaughter. A child Isabelle dreamed about. A child he never knew existed. The weight of that truth settles slowly over him. And for the first time in 10 years, the silence at Isabelle's grave no longer belongs only to him. For the rest of that morning, Richard says very little. After Amara finishes building her tower of stones, Darius gently calls her over. The girl wipes her hands on her jacket and waves goodbye to the grave with casual affection, as if she is leaving someone who can still hear her. Bye, Mommy, she whispers. The words stay with Richard long after they walk away. When the cemetery grows quiet again, he remains there alone beneath the oak tree, Isabelle's letter folded carefully in his coat pocket. The rose he dropped earlier lies beside the gravestone, half hidden by fallen leaves. He kneels slowly and picks it up. For 10 years, he has come here with apologies. But today, something else sits inside his chest, something heavier than grief. Responsibility. 3 days later, a thin folder lands on Richard's desk. The man who delivers it leaves without a word. Richard waits until the office door closes before opening it. The report inside is neat and methodical. Typed pages, official records, public filings, photographs clipped to the corners. The private investigator has verified everything. Darius Holt, 30 years old, former electrician, current groundskeeper at Greenwood Cemetery, no criminal record. Residential address, a 1-bedroom apartment in Sunset Park. Average annual income, modest. Neighbors' statements, quiet, reliable, devoted father. Richard flips the page. Amara Holt, age 9, public elementary school in Brooklyn. Attendance, excellent. Teacher notes, creative, polite, sometimes shy. A small photo is attached near the bottom. Amara stands in front of a classroom bulletin board, holding a drawing of a bright blue sky with uneven stars. Richard stares at the picture for a long time. The resemblance to Isabelle is undeniable. Not just the eyes. The same slight curve of the mouth when she concentrates. The same thoughtful stillness in her posture. Richard turns another page. Adrienne Cole. The name feels familiar now. The report includes a brief news clipping from several years earlier. Local carpenter, killed in construction accident. Age, 26. Survived by daughter, Amara. Richard closes the folder slowly. The quiet hum of the office air conditioning fills the room. For the first time since the cemetery, the full weight of the truth settles into him. Everything Darius said was real. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing invented. Just a life that unfolded completely outside Richard's world. He leans back in his chair and rubs his eyes. A number from the report catches his attention again. Amara was 3 when Adrian died. 3. For 6 years after that, Darius had raised her alone. Richard imagines the narrow apartment described in the report. Late nights. Bills stacking on a kitchen table. A child growing up without either parent. And somehow, despite all of that, Amara had still found the time to build tiny towers of stones beside a grave. Richard closes the folder. His hand rests on top of it for a long moment. Then he reaches for the phone. Cancel my afternoon meetings, he tells his assistant. There is a pause on the other end. All of them? She asks carefully. All of them. The following week, Richard returns to Greenwood Cemetery. The morning is cooler now. A thin mist clings to the ground between the old headstones. Instead of walking directly to the oak tree, he follows the narrow gravel paths deeper into the cemetery. Eventually, he spots Darius near the far wall. The man is trimming a line of shrubs with electric clippers. The quiet buzz of the tool fills the air. When he notices Richard approaching, he switches the clippers off. Mr. Witmore, he says in surprise. Richard, he corrects gently. Darius removes his gloves and wipes his hands on his jeans. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Richard nods toward a wooden bench beneath a nearby maple tree. Do you have a moment? Darius checks his watch. 10-minute break. They walk over and sit. A few leaves drift down slowly around them. For a while, neither man speaks. Then Richard finally says, I verified your story. Darius nods calmly. I figured you might. It wasn't because I doubted you, Richard continues. I just needed certainty. I understand. Richard looks down at his hands. My granddaughter, he says quietly. The words still feel unfamiliar. Darius studies his face. Yes, he says. Richard exhales slowly. I missed the first 9 years of her life. Not entirely, Darius replies. Richard glances at him. You still have the rest of her life ahead, Darius says gently. If you want it. I do. The answer comes faster than Richard expects. But then his voice softens. I just don't know how to begin. Darius leans back on the bench. The first step, he says, is admitting you want to be there. Richard nods. I do. The second step, Darius continues, is showing up. Richard lets out a quiet breath. I'd like to see Amara again, he says. Darius doesn't answer immediately. The breeze moves through the maple leaves above them. She's been through a lot, he says after a moment. I know. She lost her mother before she was born, Darius continues. Then she lost Adrian when she was 3. Richard lowers his gaze. I won't rush anything, he says quietly. Darius studies him for several seconds. Where would you want to meet? Somewhere she feels comfortable. A long pause follows. Then Darius nods once. I'll talk to her. Richard's shoulders relax slightly. If she wants to meet, Darius continues, we'll do it on her terms. That's fair. Another leaf drifts down between them. Richard watches it land on the gravel. Thank you, he says softly. Darius gives a small shrug. We'll see how she feels. 3 days later, Richard's phone rings in the early evening. The number is unfamiliar. He answers immediately. Hello? Richard, Darius says. Richard straightens in his chair. I talked to Amara, and she's curious about you. Richard feels his pulse quicken. What did she say? She asked what you look like, Darius replies. What you do, and why you're only showing up now. Richard closes his eyes briefly. And? Darius's voice softens slightly. She wants to meet. Richard exhales slowly. Where? Prospect Park, Darius says. There is a faint smile in his voice. Near the playground she likes. Saturday morning. 10 o'clock. Richard doesn't hesitate. I'll be there. Saturday morning arrives faster than Richard expects. He wakes before dawn. For several minutes he simply lies there, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse while the faint gray light of morning spreads slowly across the room. The city outside is quiet. A rare moment. Normally, mornings like this would be filled with emails, schedules, market reports. Today, there is none of that. Only a simple thought circling in his mind. 10 o'clock. He gets dressed more carefully than usual. Not a suit. Jeans. A navy sweater. Clothes that make him look less like the man whose name sits on skyscrapers, and more like someone who belongs in a park. Prospect Park is already alive when he arrives. Children run across open grass. Cyclists glide along the winding paths. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks excitedly while chasing a tennis ball. The air smells faintly of wet leaves and coffee drifting from a nearby cart. Richard walks slowly toward the playground Darius described. His heart beats harder than it ever has before a business negotiation. He spots them near the swings. Darius stands a few steps back with his hands in the pockets of a worn jacket. Amara is on a swing. Her small legs pump through the air as she glides back and forth, her curly pigtails bouncing behind her. For a moment, Richard simply watches. The sight of her laughing, free and light against the autumn sky, feels strangely unfamiliar to him. Then Darius notices him and lifts a hand. Richard. Amara slows the swing by dragging her sneakers against the ground. The metal chains creak softly. She studies him as he walks closer. Hi, Amara, Richard says gently. Do you remember me? She nods. You're my grandpa. The word lands softly between them. Richard kneels slightly, so he's at her level. That's right. Amara tilts her head. Dad said you wanted to spend time with me. I do. Why? The question is simple. Direct. Richard pauses. He glances at Darius, who gives a small shrug as if to say, Asterisk. Your turn. Asterisk. Richard turns back to Amara. Because your mom was very important to me, he says carefully. And when I found out about you, I wanted to know you too. Amara thinks about that. Her small shoe taps lightly against the dirt beneath the swing. Did my mom talk about you? Richard hesitates. A memory flashes through his mind, Isabelle's letter. Everyone deserves a second chance. She loved me, he finally says. But sometimes I wasn't very good at showing it. Amara nods thoughtfully, as if this explanation fits somewhere inside her understanding of the world. My dad says grown-ups are bad at saying feelings sometimes. Richard smiles faintly. Your dad sounds wise. I know. She pushes herself slightly on the swing again. Then, she looks at him. Can you push me? The request is so ordinary it nearly breaks him. I'd love to. He steps behind the swing and places his hands lightly on the back. The chains rattle softly as he pushes. Amara swings forward with a delighted laugh. Higher, she calls. Richard pushes again, a little stronger. The girl arcs through the air, her laughter bright and unrestrained. Behind them, Darius watches quietly. After a few minutes, Amara drags her feet again to slow down. My turn to ask a question, she says. Richard raises an eyebrow. All right. What do you do? I build buildings, Richard answers. Big ones? Yes. Her eyes widen. So you're a rich person. Richard considers that. I have a lot of money, he admits. Amara nods like she expected that. Does it make you happy? Richard pauses again. He watches a group of children chasing each other across the grass. Sometimes, he says slowly, but happiness mostly comes from being with people you care about. Amara seems satisfied with that answer. They walk through the park together for a while. Amara skips along the path, collecting interesting leaves. One shaped like a star, another bright red like fire. Richard buys hot chocolate and cookies from a small cart near the playground. Steam curls into the cold air as Amara takes a careful sip. Too hot, she announces. Darius chuckles softly. Blow on it first. Amara obeys. Then she glances at Richard again. Will you come back again? The question surprises him. If you want me to. She considers this seriously. Then nods. Okay. As the afternoon light begins to soften, Darius checks his watch. We should head home. Amara finishes the last of her cookie crumbs. Then suddenly she runs forward and wraps her arms around Richard's waist. The hug is quick, tight, unexpected. Richard freezes for a second before gently placing his arms around her small shoulders. Bye, Grandpa Richard, she says before pulling away. She runs back to Darius, grabbing his hand. Richard stands still, watching them walk toward the park exit. The warmth of that brief hug lingers like sunlight on his chest. For the first time in many years, the word family begins to feel real again. The private elevator hums softly as it rises. Amara stands between Darius and Richard, watching the numbers glow above the door. Shawu, Shaleo, Shutsi. She presses her nose briefly against the polished metal panel and giggles at her reflection. This elevator is fast, she says. Richard smiles faintly. It goes straight to the penthouse. Darius shifts slightly beside her, hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket. His eyes move around the elevator interior, taking in the polished steel, the quiet lighting, the silent efficiency of everything. He has spent years working in places where machines squeak and rattle. This one moves like a whisper. The elevator reaches the top floor. Ding. The doors slide open. And the city disappears. The noise of Manhattan traffic, horns, wind between buildings vanishes the moment they step inside. The penthouse is silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretch across the entire wall, revealing the skyline like a painting. Sunlight spills across pale marble floors and sleek furniture that looks more like sculpture than something meant to be used. Amara freezes just inside the doorway. Her eyes widen. Whoa, she breathes. She turns slowly in a circle, staring up at the high ceiling. This place is bigger than our whole building. Darius gives a quiet laugh, though his shoulders remain slightly tense. Richard notices. For years, he had seen this apartment as normal, comfortable, necessary for someone in his position. Now, seeing it through their eyes, it suddenly feels enormous and strangely empty. Come in, he says gently. Amara steps forward carefully, her sneakers making soft squeaks against the marble. Her gaze drifts toward the massive windows. Can you see the whole city from here? Almost, Richard says. She presses her hands against the glass and peers down. Everything looks tiny. Behind her, Darius remains near the entrance. Richard senses the hesitation. "Don't worry," he says quietly. "Nothing here bites." Darius smiles slightly and finally steps farther inside. Richard leads them down the hallway. "I wanted to show you something," he tells Amara. They enter a quiet study lined with shelves and paintings. Sunlight spills across the walls where several framed artworks hang. Amara stops immediately. "Did my mom paint those?" Richard nods. "She painted many things when she was younger." He gestures toward a large watercolor. The painting shows a calm lake surrounded by rolling green hills, the sky glowing with streaks of orange and purple sunset. Amara walks closer. "My mom made that?" "Yes," Richard says softly. "She painted it when she was 19. Amara studies the brushstrokes as if they might speak. Darius watches quietly from a few steps behind her. Richard moves to a nearby cabinet and opens a wooden box. Inside are photographs, old journals, and small keepsakes. He lifts out a framed sketch. Amara leans forward. It shows a sleeping baby drawn in soft pencil lines. Beside it is a tiny handwritten note, "For my child someday." Amara's eyes grow wide. "Is that me?" Richard kneels beside her. "I believe it might be." The girl touches the glass gently with her fingertips. "My mom dreamed about me?" Richard's voice grows quieter. "Yes, very much." He reaches into the box again and removes a small pendant shaped like a lion. "This belonged to her too." Amara holds it carefully as Darius helps fasten the clasp around her neck. The pendant glints softly in the sunlight. While Amara studies the drawings and photographs, Darius walks slowly toward the window overlooking the city. Richard joins him. For a moment, they both stand in silence. "I never thought I'd stand in a place like this," Darius says eventually. His tone isn't jealous, just thoughtful. "It feels like another world." Richard nods. "For a long time, it was the only world I knew." Darius looks out over the skyline. "So why change now?" Richard doesn't answer immediately. His eyes drift toward Amara, sitting on the rug surrounded by Isabelle's drawings. "Meeting her," he says quietly. Darius turns slightly. "Amara showed me what I lost," Richard continues. "Not just Isabelle, but the chance to be a real family." Darius folds his arms. "Amara deserves more than a grandfather who shows up because he feels guilty." Richard nods without hesitation. "You're right." The honesty surprises Darius. "But guilt isn't the only reason," Richard adds. "What else?" Richard watches Amara carefully placing the drawings back into the box. "Love," he says, "and the fact that she deserves to know she has family." Darius studies him for a long moment. Trust does not appear quickly in his expression, but something softens slightly. "This can't move too fast," he says finally. "I understand. If I think it's hurting her," Darius continues. "We stop." "Agreed." They shake hands briefly. Across the room, Amara looks up. "Grandpa Richard?" "Yes?" She holds up the baby sketch again. "Can I keep this picture?" Richard smiles gently. "Of course." She beams. Then she returns to studying the artwork, completely absorbed. Richard watches her quietly. For years, his penthouse had been a place filled with expensive objects and empty evenings. Now, for the first time, it holds something else. A child sitting on the floor, looking at her mother's dreams, and beginning to make them real again. Winter begins quietly. The wind grows sharper along the Brooklyn streets, slipping between old brick buildings and rattling loose fire escapes. The trees in Prospect Park stand bare now, their branches thin and skeletal against the gray sky. Richard keeps coming, every weekend. Sometimes to the park, sometimes to the small apartment in Sunset Park where Amara and Darius live. At first, the visits feel careful, almost rehearsed. Richard brings small gifts, a watercolor set after Amara mentions she likes painting, a book about constellations when she talks about the stars she can see from the fire escape outside her window. He learns quickly that the best gift is not the object, it is time. One Saturday afternoon, he sits cross-legged on the living room floor helping Amara build a crooked Lego tower while a cartoon movie plays quietly on the television. The apartment is warm but cramped. A narrow sofa pressed against one wall. A small kitchen visible through an open doorway. Richard notices how every piece of furniture seems to serve more than one purpose. Nothing here is decorative. Everything is used. Darius moves around the kitchen making soup in a battered pot. The smell of garlic and onions fills the air. Dinner's almost ready, he says. Amara barely looks up. 5 more minutes, she insists, stacking another Lego piece onto the tower. Richard smiles faintly. He has attended hundreds of corporate dinners in rooms filled with crystal glasses and linen tablecloths. Yet somehow this small apartment feels more alive than any of them. Not every moment is easy. One evening, Richard arrives to find Darius sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers. The room is quiet. Amara is still at school for an after-class art program. Darius doesn't notice Richard at first. He's staring down at a stack of bills, one hand pressed against his forehead. Richard knocks gently on the open door. Darius? The man looks up quickly. Oh, Richard. I didn't hear you. Richard steps inside. The bills are spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle that refuses to fit together. Rent notice, electric bill, a repair estimate for the apartment heater. The total circled at the bottom. $3,000. For Richard, it's the cost of a dinner meeting. For Darius, it looks like a mountain. Everything okay? Richard asks carefully. Darius exhales slowly. I'll figure it out. Richard pulls out the chair opposite him and sits. You don't have to figure it out alone. Darius shakes his head almost immediately. I appreciate the thought, but I don't want charity. It's not charity, Richard says quietly. It's family. Darius meets his eyes. You and I barely know each other, but we both care about Amara. The room goes silent for a moment. Darius drums his fingers lightly on the table. I don't want to owe you anything. Then call it a loan, Richard replies. Pay me back whenever you can. Darius leans back in his chair. Pride and practicality wrestle across his face. I'll think about it, he finally says. Richard nods. That's all I ask. He doesn't wait for an answer. A few days later, Richard quietly makes a phone call to his lawyer. 6 months of rent are prepaid anonymously through the building management. The heater repair is arranged through a neighborhood housing program. No names attached. No explanation. Then Richard makes another call. He contacts the manager of Greenwood Cemetery, a man he has known professionally for years. I hear you have a good employee named Darius Holt, Richard says. Best groundskeeper we've had in a while, the manager replies. Richard pauses. Are there any open positions that offer more stability? The manager thinks for a moment. There's a maintenance coordinator role opening up next month. Would he qualify? Easily. Richard nods to himself. Then give him the opportunity. 3 days later, Darius shows up at Richard's office unannounced. He stands near the doorway with his arms folded. Did you do something? He asks. Richard looks up from his desk. What do you mean? I got an email from cemetery management, Darius says. Interview invitation, maintenance coordinator position. Richard leans back slightly. I mentioned you were reliable. Darius narrows his eyes. That's all. That's all. The silence stretches between them. If I get that job, Darius says slowly, it'll be because I earned it. Richard nods. That's the only way it should happen. A week later, the answer arrives. Darius gets the job. The raise isn't enormous, but it's enough to ease the pressure of bills and winter repairs. That evening, Richard stops by the apartment. Amara greets him at the door with excitement. Dad got a new job, she announces proudly. Darius appears behind her, shaking his head slightly. She told the whole building already. Richard laughs softly. Well, congratulations. Darius meets his eyes. Something like gratitude flickers there. Thank you, he says quietly. They sit down for dinner together. Soup, bread, simple food served in mismatched bowls. Amara talks non-stop about a painting she's working on at school. Richard listens carefully, asking questions about colors and shapes. Later, after Amara goes to bed, Darius pours 2 cups of tea. They sit at the small kitchen table. For what it's worth, Darius says slowly. When I first met you at the cemetery, I assumed you were the kind of billionaire who'd try to buy your way into Amara's life. Richard looks down at his cup. And now? Darius shrugs. Now I think you're trying to learn something money never taught you. Richard lifts his eyes. What's that? Darius takes a sip of tea. How to show up. Richard nods quietly. He knows Darius is right, because for the first time in his life, success no longer feels like a building rising into the sky. It feels like a small kitchen table, 2 cups of tea, and the slow, careful work of becoming family. The call takes Richard 2 full days to make. The phone sits on the edge of his desk the entire time, silent but heavy with everything it represents. He has negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, stared down hostile investors, and reshaped entire neighborhoods with a signature. But this number feels different. Marcus, his son. For 4 years, they have spoken only through short holiday emails, brief, polite messages that never say anything real. Richard picks up the phone late in the evening. The city outside the penthouse windows glows in cold winter light. He dials. The line rings 3 times. Then Marcus answers. Hello? Richard's throat tightens. Marcus, it's Dad. There is a pause. Not surprise, not warmth, just silence measuring the distance between them. I know, Marcus says finally. Your name showed up on the screen. Another pause. What do you want to talk about? Marcus asks. Richard exhales slowly. Family. Marcus gives a quiet, humorless laugh. That's a new topic. And Isabelle, Richard continues. The laughter stops. And your niece. The silence that follows is heavier this time. My what? Marcus asks. They meet the next morning at a small cafe in the West Village. It's neutral ground, far from Richard's penthouse, and far from Marcus's architecture studio in Tribeca. Richard arrives early. He chooses a table near the window and orders 2 coffees he barely touches. Outside, pedestrians hurry along the sidewalks, coats wrapped tight against the cold wind. When Marcus finally walks in, Richard almost doesn't recognize him. His son looks older, 36 now. A few gray strands have appeared at his temples. His clothes are simple dark sweater, jeans, messenger bag slung over one shoulder, but there is a quiet confidence in the way he carries himself. Marcus spots him and approaches. Dad. Richard stands instinctively. For a second, he wonders if he should offer a handshake or a hug. In the end, neither happens. Marcus sits. You look older, Marcus says. Richard gives a faint smile. So do you. A waitress sets the coffees down between them. For several seconds, neither man speaks. Marcus finally breaks the silence. You said something about a niece. Richard nods slowly. Yes. He tells the story carefully. The cemetery. Darius. Amara. The discovery that Isabelle had a daughter no one in the family ever knew about. Marcus listens without interrupting. His expression remains almost unreadable. When Richard finishes, the cafe noise seems suddenly louder around them, spoons clinking against cups, low conversations drifting between tables. Marcus stares down at the coffee in front of him. Then he rubs his face slowly. Isabelle had a child, he says quietly. Yes. How long have you known? About 2 months. Marcus looks up sharply. And you're telling me now? Richard nods. I needed time to understand everything. Marcus leans back in his chair. You mean you needed time to manage the situation? Richard doesn't argue. You're right, he says. Marcus studies him for a moment. Then his voice lowers. Do you know what the hardest part of growing up with you was? Richard shakes his head. It wasn't the money, Marcus says. We had everything. He taps the table lightly with his finger. Except you. The words land with quiet force. You missed everything, Marcus continues. My school plays, my soccer games, my graduation. Richard looks down. I know. Do you remember what you sent me when I graduated high school? Marcus asks. Richard searches his memory. A watch, Marcus says before he can answer. A Rolex. Richard winces slightly. I was 18, Marcus continues. I didn't need a watch. He meets Richard's eyes. I needed my father. For a moment, neither man speaks. Then Marcus sighs and leans forward slightly. Did Isabelle ever get to be happy? He asks. Richard lifts his head. Yes. Marcus's eyes soften slightly. She loved a man named Adrian Cole, Richard says. They were planning a life together. Marcus looks away toward the window. At least she had that, he murmurs. The 2 men sit quietly for a while. Finally, Richard speaks again. Would you like to meet her? Marcus glances back. Does she know about me? Yes, Richard says. I told her she has an uncle who designs buildings. Marcus exhales slowly. And what does she think about that? She was excited. Marcus lets out a small breath of laughter. That sounds like Isabelle. Richard nods. They're very alike. Another silence settles between them. But this one feels slightly different, less sharp. Marcus reaches for his coffee and takes a sip. Okay, he says finally. Richard looks up. I want to meet her. Relief spreads slowly through Richard's chest. Thank you. Marcus raises a hand slightly. Don't thank me yet. Richard waits. I'm not promising forgiveness, Marcus continues. Not yet. I understand. But she's my niece, Marcus says, and she deserves to know her family. Richard nods. That's all I'm hoping for. Marcus studies him for another moment. You're really trying this time, he says. Richard doesn't look away. Yes. Marcus sits back in his chair. Then let's see where it goes. Outside the cafe window, the winter sun finally pushes through the clouds. For the first time in years, father and son sit across from each other without walking away. The Brooklyn Children's Museum is louder than Richard expected. Children run across the colorful floor exhibits, laughter echoing against bright walls covered in painted animals and giant letters. Somewhere nearby, a group of kids pounds enthusiastically on a row of plastic drums. Richard stands near the entrance beside Darius, watching Amara at a long art table. She is leaning over a sheet of paper nearly as big as her torso, painting with intense concentration. Blue and green streak across the page, forming something that looks vaguely like a dinosaur with wings. Darius folds his arms lightly. She could stay at that table for hours, he says. Richard smiles faintly. She gets that from her mother. A few moments later, the entrance doors open again. Marcus steps inside. He pauses briefly, scanning the room until his eyes land on them. Richard lifts a hand. Marcus walks over, his expression calm but slightly uncertain. This place is louder than I imagined, he says quietly. Richard nods. Amara's over there. Marcus follows his gaze. At the art table, Amara dips a brush into a cup of water and swirls it carefully before adding another streak of paint to her dinosaur. Richard approaches slowly. Amara, he says gently. She looks up. There's someone I want you to meet. Her eyes move between Richard and Marcus with curiosity. This is Uncle Marcus, Richard says. Marcus crouches down so he's at her level. Hi, Amara. The girl studies him carefully. You're the one who designs buildings? She says. Marcus blinks, surprised. That's right. Grandpa Richard told me, she explains. Marcus glances briefly at Richard before returning his attention to her. What are you painting? A sky dinosaur, Amara says proudly. It flies over cities. Marcus smiles. Does it land on buildings? Only the tall ones. Marcus picks up a spare pencil from the table. Maybe we should draw it a landing platform. Amara's eyes brighten immediately. Okay. She slides the paper toward him. Marcus begins sketching quickly, adding a simple rooftop structure beneath the dinosaur. Amara watches closely. That's cool, she says. Richard and Darius stand a few feet away, observing quietly. He's good with her, Darius murmurs. Richard nods. He always was. After the museum, they stop at a small pizza place nearby. Amara sits between Marcus and Darius, happily eating a slice while explaining every detail of the dinosaur drawing. Marcus listens with genuine interest, asking questions about the creature's wings and where it might live. By the time the meal ends, Amara is laughing freely. When they step outside, the evening air is cold and crisp. Marcus kneels slightly in front of her. I had fun today, he says. Me too, Amara replies. Then she hugs him suddenly. Come again, she says. Marcus hesitates only a moment before hugging her back. I will. Richard watches the moment quietly. Something fragile but hopeful seems to be forming between them. A few weeks later, the fragile balance of their growing family faces another test. Darius opens his apartment door one afternoon to find a tall woman standing in the hallway. Her red hair falls neatly over the collar of an expensive coat. Her expression is composed, but her eyes carry a sharp intensity. Hello, she says. Is Richard here? Darius shakes his head. No. She studies him for a moment. You must be Darius Holt. Yes. The woman inhales slowly. My name is Catherine Witmore. Darius stiffens slightly. Richard's former wife. Isabelle's mother. I believe you know who I am, she says quietly. Darius nods. Yes. Her voice softens slightly. I heard about Amara. Darius opens the door wider but doesn't step aside. She's at school right now. Catherine nods once. I'd like to meet her. Darius crosses his arms. That's something Richard and I should talk about first. Her eyes narrow slightly. I've already tried calling him. I'll make sure he knows you came. For a moment, it seems like she might argue. Instead, she exhales slowly. I lost my daughter, she says. I'm not losing my granddaughter, too. Her words carry no anger, only grief. Darius studies her carefully. Finally, he nods. We'll arrange something. The meeting happens in the same park where Amara first met Richard. This time, more people are present. Richard, Darius, Marcus, and Catherine. Amara stands beside Darius, gripping his hand as the woman approaches. Catherine kneels down so they are eye level. Hello, sweetheart, she says gently. My name is Catherine. Amara tilts her head. Who are you? Catherine's voice trembles slightly. I'm your mother's mother. The girl blinks. My grandma? Yes. Amara studies her carefully. Do you look like my mom? Catherine smiles through a thin layer of tears. People used to say so. Amara considers this. Then, she steps forward slowly. Catherine opens a small photo album she brought. Inside are pictures of Isabelle as a child drawing pictures, climbing trees, laughing beside a birthday cake. Amara flips through the pages with fascination. That's my mom? Yes. She looks fun, Amara says. Catherine laughs softly. She was. After nearly an hour of stories and photographs, the initial tension fades. When it's time to leave, Amara wraps her arms around Catherine. You can come again, she says. Catherine hugs her gently. I'd like that very much. Richard stands a short distance away, watching the scene. Their family is still far from perfect. Old wounds remain. But slowly, piece by piece, the broken parts are beginning to connect again. And at the center of it all stands a 9-year-old girl, with bright blue eyes holding everyone together without even realizing it. Spring returns quietly to Greenwood Cemetery. The oak tree on the hill has begun to grow leaves again, small, bright green ones that shimmer when the wind moves through the branches. Sunlight filters softly across the grass, warming the stone markers scattered across the hillside. Richard arrives early, as he always does. But this time he isn't alone. Footsteps approach along the gravel path behind him. First Darius, then Marcus. Catherine follows a few steps later, carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. And beside them, holding a tiny cloth pouch in both hands, walks Amara. The girl climbs the small slope toward the oak tree with determined steps. Richard watches her quietly. She has grown slightly taller since the winter. Her hair is pulled into 2 neat braids today. The same bright blue eyes scan the area until they land on the gravestone. Hi, Mom, she says softly. She kneels beside the marker and opens the cloth pouch. Inside are several small stones, pink, gray, white, each one smooth and round. Darius smiles faintly when he sees them. Your collection, he says. Amara nods. I brought the best ones. She begins stacking them carefully beside the headstone. One stone, then another. Richard kneels nearby, watching her small hands balance each piece with surprising patience. You remember how to do it, he says. Amara glances up. I practiced. Marcus steps closer, curious. What's she building? A memory tower, Amara explains seriously. Marcus smiles. I like that name. She adds another stone. The stack wobbles slightly before settling. When she finishes, Amara sits back and admires her work. Then she looks around at the adults gathered nearby. I need one more. Richard raises an eyebrow. One more? The last one is special, Amara says. She reaches into the pouch again and pulls out a small pink stone. But instead of placing it on the tower herself, she walks over to Richard. This one is yours, she says. Richard looks at the stone resting in her palm. Mine. You put it on top. He hesitates. For years, he had stood beside Isabelle's grave feeling like a visitor, a stranger to the life she had chosen. Now the small pink stone feels strangely heavy in his hand. Are you sure? He asks. Amara nods. You're part of the family, too. The words, catch, in Richard's throat. Slowly, he stands and walks back to the tower. Everyone watches quietly. Darius, Marcus, Catherine. Richard carefully places the pink stone on the top of the stack. For a moment, the tower trembles slightly. Then it steadies. Amara beams. "See?" she says proudly. "It works." Afterward, they sit together beneath the oak tree. Catherine opens the photo album again, showing Amara pictures of Isabelle as a child. Marcus sketches a quick cartoon dinosaur in the corner of one page, making Amara giggle. Darius leans back against the trunk of the tree, watching the small group with quiet satisfaction. Richard stands a little apart, looking out across the cemetery. 10 years ago, he believed grief was something a person carried alone, something heavy and silent. But today, the hill feels different. Not lonely, shared. Amara runs over to him suddenly. "Grandpa Richard!" "Yes." She grabs his hand. "Come see this." She pulls him toward the gravestone. Beside the tower of stones, she has placed a small drawing. It shows 5 stick figures standing beneath a tree. One tall, one with long hair, 2 medium ones, and a little one in the middle. "That's us," Amara says proudly. Richard studies the drawing. "And who's that?" he asks, pointing to the small figure in the center. "That's me," she says. "And these?" She points to each stick figure. "Dad, Grandma Catherine, Uncle Marcus, and you." Richard looks at the drawing again. All 5 figures are holding hands. "Where's your mom?" he asks softly. Amara taps the oak tree in the picture. She's watching. Richard feels something warm settle quietly in his chest. For years, he believed the most important things in life were the ones that rose high above the city, glass towers, steel bridges, buildings that reached for the sky. But the most important thing he had ever built was standing right here. Not a skyscraper. A family. Amara squeezes his hand. "Grandpa?" "Yes." "Next year, we'll build an even bigger tower." Richard smiles. "I'll bring more stones." Amara laughs and runs back toward the others. Richard glances once more at the small stack beside Isabelle's grave. For the first time in many years, the apology he carried here feels lighter, not erased, but forgiven. Above them, the oak leaves rustle gently in the spring wind, and the circle once broken finally feels whole again.